I'll just go for it. First, full chorus. Second, soprano bass. Third, women. Fourth, tenors on the solo. And then everybody, and we do the chorus. Everybody comes in with the chorus. And then, okay, you have the pitches?
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel written, burnished rose of steel. As ye deal with my contenders, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with the glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
Okay. So I handed out 3 things. And don't read it now. It's for when you get home. This right here is from the LaRouchePAC website. It was posted as an HTML, very long website with lots of links. You'll see the words in bold here will take you to other primary source material. But this truly is invaluable. It's 40 years of LaRouche on the record for building a better world, a new just financial system, a new order among nations, and you'll see in here a real commitment by Lynn, by Helga, by the Schiller Institute, and by LaRouchePAC over the last 10 years to push and create a very specific shift. In other words, not to create a new string of events, not to create a singular change in policy in one specific area, but for a comprehensive advancement of humanity, an upshift of humanity into a new historical process. And that's what truly makes us different. What we're seeing now, and that's why I printed out the latest edition of EIR, and I took a few articles out of it in order to make it really concise. We're really seeing the beginning of this new historic process coming together. And I think these two documents taken together, the latest edition of EIR, which is merely the most recent cataloging, discussion, and presentation of the developments of the last week, versus what we have here as the developments of the last 40 years. The commitment among this organization over the last 40 years to actually start this process. And viewed together, I think it really should compel people to get a sense of how crucial this organization is in shaping and advancing the direction of relations among nations and a future of a population which in the United States really needs to join. We have a moral, a historical duty to join with this process, the LaRouche process that is being developed right now all across the world. And the recent statements of Christina Kirchner, the recent statements of President El-Sisi from Egypt, the recent presentation at the United Nations by these individuals, plus the Brazilian president. I mean, this is very compelling. And for people who want more on this, our website is a phenomenal source. The EIR that I gave you is a phenomenal source. And I think we just really should have a certain jubilation right now. There's really reason to be happy. And once the United States moves very explicitly on some of our immediate directives, then the world really is poised to welcome a new era for humanity. And what could be more in order, given the direction this country's gone, specifically since 9/11, but really since the assassination and cover-up of John F. Kennedy. So that's all I have for introductory remarks. You'll also see the latest statement we have here by Lynn. We're getting this out en masse. It was his remarks after the Holder resignation, which I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. You can read that also at your leisure. Before we welcome Bruce, we're going to play LaRouche's, a clip from LaRouche's webcast of last week, just to set the tone a bit from the horse's mouth, as they say. And then Bruce will take over. Bruce is a longtime advisor to Mr. LaRouche, a longtime collaborator of Mr. LaRouche, and we're lucky to have him here. So, welcome.
Well, this shouldn't come as a surprise, but Obama responded to this vote in Scotland by using it as an opportunity to reaffirm his special relationship with the Queen. He said, "This is a sign of our strong and special relationship with the people of Great Britain." And so if you ask me, Obama would probably want to have a referendum here in the United States that we should rejoin the British Empire. Or maybe that's giving him too much credit. Maybe he would just order it through an executive order.
I don't think there's morality in Obama. I don't think there's not any real Obama.
No.
Nothing. No honesty, no nothing. He's a piece of you know what.
Yes.
And that's, the sooner we get rid of him and throw him in the trash barrel or send him to some place where, well, how about Saudi Arabia? That's a good place to send him. The trash is already collected there. They can have all the fun they want to, as long as they stay in their own territory.
Right. Well, maybe this is a good occasion to remember Scotland's poet, Robert Burns.
Should have begun.
He wrote a poem condemning the original Act of Union when Scotland was forced to join Great Britain, and I think it's apt. He says, this is a short poem, "What force or guile could not subdue through many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few for hireling traitors' wages. The English steel we could disdain, secure in valor's station, but English gold has been our bane. Such a parcel of rogues is our nation." So he says, we are bought and sold for English gold. Such a parcel of rogues is our nation. Now, there's a question that I'd like to ask before I ask Megan to come up to the podium. And this is on the subject of what occurred this week in the historic meetings between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. Xi Jinping made his first official state trip to India as president of China, and together with Modi, he declared that India and China together will build a new Asian century. And it's interesting, this is reference to an idea that Deng Xiaoping used to emphasize, which originated with Nehru, who said, when China and India join hands, we shall create an Asian century. And then at the same time, Prime Minister Modi made a statement this week saying that China and India represent 35% of the world population. With the arithmetic of our relations, he said, I am convinced that together we can script history. Now, he also said, however, this relationship is not merely arithmetic, but it goes beyond plain arithmetic, which I think is really an excellent point, and it's a point that your wife Helga made repeatedly, both during her trip to China and also since her return. She has stressed that the effects of this new paradigm of the BRICS countries and the agreements that they have signed goes way beyond just those countries themselves. And the effects of Xi Jinping's declaration of his intention to build the new Silk Road goes way beyond those projects per se. And what Helga has emphasized is that while all of these are crucially important, the non-linear or the non-arithmetic effects of the optimism that has been unleashed by these nations and what these nations have done to embolden other nations and other countries on this planet can be seen everywhere from Egypt to Argentina, for example. And in fact, just this week, there were very significant meetings between the foreign minister of Argentina, Timmerman, who went to Cairo to meet with al-Sisi in Egypt. And both of them declared that their nations have a shared commitment to defending the developing world and emphasized that there is a long history of cooperation between Egypt and Argentina, dating back to the time of Juan Perón and Abdel Nasser. So what's very clear is that this New World Economic Order, as it was conceived and put into that kind of idea in the 1970s, with your direct involvement, has been on the agenda for 40 years, and it has now arrived and is here to stay as an efficient force on this planet, something that the British Empire has been trying to desperately stop for 40 years, including in their direct attacks against you and your role. So my question is, I guess, is the sun now setting on the British Empire, and what can we do to hasten their demise?
No, the British Empire we have to be rid of it, period. There's no question about that. Right. The problem here is that people are still thinking in terms of the relics of a system of empire. They're thinking of monarchies and empires. Now, in point of fact, this may look good to some people, the naive, but they don't think clearly enough. What we're talking about, we want to eliminate the entire system of government which we have found dumped on us in various forms. Now, that does not mean we are opposed to cleaning up the mess in various parts of the world. Yes, we definitely want to clean up the mess, but how do we intend to do it? Do we intend to create a formation of sovereign nation states? Are sovereign nation states a solution? I would say no. I would say that's another trick to catch us again. What we want to do is eliminate certain features of government on this planet permanently. Now that means that we want to create an international community of common interest, and that we want to share a discussion and a discovery of what that common interest is. Not just a common interest, but thinking into the future, thinking into several generations ahead. In other words, personal development is not really very good these days. What happens in various societies is not really good. It's a sham. It's a makeshift. What you want to do is evolve a form of government of the types we would think we imagine we want. But we want that kind of government, the kind of government which frees us from the tradition of the old systems of rule. And that has to come, and that can come. For example, you have the case of the BRICS, right? Now, the case of the BRICS shows you the model of the possibility and the promise of success. So what we want to do is we want to take the BRICS conception and say we don't no longer have a system of governments, but we do have a system. We have a system, we ourselves create an international system of a new type, in which the people in various parts of the world do what they have to do. But what we want is the conception, what is the meaning of human life? What is the meaning of the existence of human life? Why should you live? Why should you have a human life? For what good is it? To have a free ride on a good life? Or is there a meaning to humanity's role in this solar system and beyond? And beyond. Is there a meaning by which we should be guided in the shaping of the future of mankind within the solar system and a wee bit beyond? A new kind of system unconceived so far by most of mankind. But that's what we really need. We don't want to have a new system, which is just brand new and different. What we want to do is to say, how can man properly manage himself? What is the purpose of man's managing himself? What are the goals? What is the future of mankind? How do we shape the future of mankind? These are questions which are not even generally asked. And therefore we have to take a moment aside from the ordinary. We have to say, let's take the lessons we learn from South America and Central America. That's just an example. Now let's pack in with India, pack in with China. China is a very good example of what the potential is. So what we want to do is bring about a conscious idea of what mankind is, what the permanent meaning of mankind shall be, what mankind shall do in space. We have to think about that kind of thing. We don't want the old stuff. We don't just make a cheap change. from the past. And so mankind has to rethink himself. And what you're seeing in South America, in some cases, what you're seeing elsewhere, is an attempt by some governments or some parts of governments to discover a new principle of government, in which government becomes the purpose, not the means, but the purpose, in order to give birth to a conception of man that mankind has never received before, to reach a level which mankind has never accomplished before. That's our mission, or that should be our mission. And what we should be doing is thinking about what all that means. We've got to have a completely new conception of what mankind is. And there are people now enough on the planet. We see in China, for example, a developmental process which is very interesting features inside there. Other things, in South America, the BRICS cases. All these things are examples of model, not of models as such, but examples of models which open the gates to creating a new freedom of mankind in society. And that's what we have to do. We have to re-educate mankind within himself and give mankind a vision of himself which he had never achieved before, and let him rejoice.
Well, I think that was a good way to start, because that's really the issue that we have to take up. I should say I'm happy to be in Boston again. I haven't been here for a long time. And I hope you don't mind if I sit while I talk, because I have some difficulty standing for extended periods of time. And I thank Miles for that introduction, although I have to correct him. I will agree that I've been a long-time collaborator with LaRouche, but I quibble with the word advisor. I'd say probably student is better characterization, and I think that was a good indication of why student is what we all are, because I think there's one thing Lynn has taught us over the years, or at least certainly tried to teach us, is that the thing that is the most important about mankind is also the hardest thing to do, and that is to be able to change the way you think. And the issue that's really confronting man right now, and the issue that everybody in this room really has to deal with, and the future of mankind is going to depend on whether or not we can change the way we think. And people say that all the time, but it's really a lot easier to say than it is to do, especially because there's a lot of ways to think you're changing the way you think, but you're really doing the same thing over and over again. And also, if you're changing the way you think, you're thinking about something that you've never thought about before. So how do you know if you're right? And I think just this question, which Lynn just answered at last week's webcast, really illustrates that. What we're talking about here is we have an opportunity to lead a process in which we create a form of society, a form of existence for mankind which we've never had before. And we're not talking about a new treaty arrangement. We're not talking about a new arrangement among nations. We're talking about creating a transformation in the way man looks at himself on this planet, as Lynn said, and beyond. And the beyond is a very important thing. Now, what I want to do is try and be a little concrete about that without going into too much detail, but with the hope that we can provoke enough discussion among ourselves so that we can begin to think about what this actually means. And I think that requires that we do two things. First of all, we have to look at where the world is, and we have to assess our situation. But we have to do that from the standpoint of a different way of thinking than we're accustomed to. And I think this gets at the nub of what Lynn was talking about, which is we have to think about where we are and think about how we got here from the standpoint of the future, not from the standpoint of the past. Now that's something people have heard a lot. LaRouche says it, a lot of people have it, and it sounds quite nice. But how can you think about where we are today from the standpoint of the future, because the future hasn't occurred? You have no idea what it is. So is this, what the first question you have to sort of come to is, what do we mean by thinking about it from the standpoint of the future? Well, what is the future? Is the future something that just will come to be? Or is the future something that we're going to create? Something that we're going to bring into existence? And this is something that humans can do. This gets at the unique quality of human beings that is different from all other species, is that when we think of the future, we can, not that we always do, but we can think about the future not as a continuation of the past, not as something that's familiar to us, but that is a new state of existence that we can actually bring into existence by our own creative powers. And that has to be done, because the way things have been done, not just for the last 40 years, not just for the last 12 years, although there's certain relevance to that, not just for the last 500 years, but as Lynn said, for the entirety of human existence, that must change right now, or mankind will become extinct, quite likely become extinct. And that is, we have to create a new, as LaRouche often says, a new paradigm for mankind. Because the current system of relations, everything about the current system of relations is collapsing. There's some obvious things, right? Like the financial system is collapsing. The economy is collapsing. The physical conditions of life for most people on this planet are collapsing. It's collapsing because we're also going through major physical changes on the earth, as exemplified like the drought situation out in the western United States, which is not caused by global warming. It's not caused by anything that man does. It's caused by the changing position of the Earth with respect to the galaxy and the position of the galaxy with respect to other galaxies. It's a very complex process which we don't understand. We're going to have to learn to understand it. We're facing challenges like the potential for an asteroid strike against the Earth, which would be a devastating strike. We're facing challenges, for example, of new diseases, not just Ebola, but other types of diseases which are emerging. But do we fight these diseases one by one, or do we have to actually get to the root of what actually is disease and how does biological processes work? We also face the immediate crisis that we have a crumbling empire, the British Empire, and the imperial system, which knows it's crumbling and has the power to destroy all mankind in order to keep itself from, in a desperate attempt, a desperately failing attempt to keep itself in power. And by this I'm referring to the strategy of tension that's coming out of London and being carried out by Obama, which you see not just which you see all over the world. This year is the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I, which started in 1914, and there's been a lot of discussion in the popular press about that. And you know, you look back on the outbreak of World War I. And this is a good example of thinking, how do you think about the future? Because we have the advantage of looking back at this period and knowing what the outcome would be. But all the decisions that were made leading up to World War I were decisions that seemed perfectly reasonable, that seemed like exactly the right thing to do, even up till the very end. The war broke out in August. In July of 1914, the measures people took, everybody thought were war avoidance measures. If we mobilize our troops, this will be the best way to prevent war. If we make this alliance, this will be the best way to prevent war. This is the way to stop, to prevent it. Everything seemed like war prevention measures. And yet, the war broke out, and the British soldiers sang as they went off to war, "We'll be home by Christmas." And the war went on for 4 or 5 years, and millions of people were killed, which was followed by a Spanish flu, which killed 10 times or 20 times more people than died in the war. And that war really didn't end. It was just an exhaustion, which then broke out in a few years later in World War II, which ended with what could wipe out all civilization, which is the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So now we're talking about a continuation. That war didn't end. We've been in perpetual war since the end of World War II. It was called the Cold War for a while, but the Cold War was pretty hot because there was actually regional wars all over the planet. And this was going on from the 1890s on. You had a Balkan War, you had a war between Russia and Japan, you had wars in Asia, you had wars in the Americas, and they all became a world war. Now what do we have? We have wars on the European continent, in Ukraine. We have the so-called Asia pivot. We have the tensions between Japan and China and so forth. All these things are being escalated and exacerbated by the British through their puppet Obama. And every step that's being taken, people are rationalizing as something that is necessary and seems perfectly reasonable to them, which could erupt, unlike 1914, into a global conflagration which would begin with an exchange of thermonuclear weapons which could wipe out the entire civilization. So in a certain sense, you know, either the bombs or the bugs are going to get us. So if we don't change the way mankind thinks, mankind isn't going to exist. So how do we change what we think? Well, first of all, we have to think about the way we think. And which is the first step, which most people don't want to do because they don't really want to think about how they think. They want to think what they think, but they don't want to think why they think it, right? So why do we think the way we think about the world, right? Now, this, of course, brings us to the point that LaRouche talks about frequently, which he talks about it from the standpoint of the so-called myth of the tragedy of Prometheus, right? Which has been sort of a window on the way people think for at least the last 2,000–3,000 years. But it's actually a universal idea, this story of Prometheus, because it really encapsulates the way people think. And this, we can talk more about it later, by the way, is really where the people who force us to think the way we think about how we think, are great artists and scientists. But the scientists need the great artists because to actually think the way they think. It's very rare a scientist who's also a great artist. And some of you probably know the story of Prometheus because LaRouche has talked about it a lot, but I'll just summarize it very quickly. Because Prometheus was, it's a story that's unique to European culture, but it's not unique to European culture because all cultures, even more ancient than European cultures, have similar stories, right? But Prometheus was half God and half man. And he gave the, as Aeschylus recounts in the story of, in the drama, he gave not the fire to man, but as he says, he also gave man the ability to think about how he thinks. And he said this in the form of astronomy, i.e. science. He says he gave man the power to know the rising and setting of the stars, which is actually the ability to rise above sense perception, because you see motions of the stars, but the motions of the stars that you see are not the motions that are actually occurring. The motions that are actually occurring you can't see at all. So you have to be able to imagine them. You have to envision them in your mind, right? And Prometheus says, I gave man poetry, the ability to be able to communicate ideas, which are also things you can't see. And I gave man number, to be able to understand these things. And I also gave man blind hope, right? Now, what is blind hope? Hope is the belief, the understanding that you can bring about a new condition that doesn't currently exist. How does man, and we do this because we can create these new states in our imaginations, and we can bring into existence what we create in our imaginations. And in the Greek language, the word for foresight became Prometheus. I'm not a linguistic expert on the Greek language, so I can't tell you if the name, if the word Prometheus meant foresight before Aeschylus's play, or before this myth, or whether it came afterwards. But that word became known as Prometheus. It became the word. So the concept here is the power of our imagination to imagine not just new conditions and states about the world that don't currently exist, but new conditions about our own mind. That is, we can imagine thinking a different way than we currently think. And this is what is the real drama that's being played out in world history right now. Look at what's happening around the world. I mean, Miles alluded to some of it, right? You have on the one hand this transatlantic system, North America and Europe, which is crumbling. There's nothing new coming out of these areas of the world. The policies of all the governments in North America and Europe are the same policies they follow over and over and over again. The same reactions. Look, for example, and then you have on the other side the new way of thinking about relations among nations, about what is possible for mankind, that is exemplified by the policies in China, the other BRICS nations, and also other countries around the world. Think, for example, if you followed it, just past week at the United Nations, you had the President of the United States speak, Obama, right? What did he say? We need more war. We need to assert more power. What did every European leader say? The same thing. And yet, you listen to the speeches that came from the BRICS countries, although the President of India was speaking today, so I didn't hear his speech. Or the President of China, Xi Jinping's address. He hasn't spoken at the UN, I don't think, but what he's been saying recently. They're talking about a new direction for mankind, bringing into existence a new set of relations among nations, where instead of war, instead of fighting for one nation or group of nations or one system to impose itself on another, that we actually create a system of among nations based on the common interests of mankind. There was a conference in China just earlier this week on the 2,265th anniversary of the birth of Confucius. So let's not get too arrogant about Western European civilization, right? I mean, our country's 200 years old, right? In China, they're talking about the 2,265th anniversary of the founding, the prominent thinker in China, and he was a latecomer, because Chinese civilization goes back at least 5,000 years, right? It's been a continuous civilization that has been held together by these ideas that were expressed by Confucius. But he was, even though he's in the past for us, he was the future of a more ancient civilization, right? And here the president of China is speaking about this, and what does he say? We have to learn to have a dialogue among cultures where we exchange we learn from each other's civilizations about how to advance mankind as a whole. This is not just a philosophical statement coming from the president of the most populous country on earth, which is quite already startling, right? But this is the president of a nation that has a program to mine helium-3 on the moon, that has a program to develop infrastructure capabilities all throughout the Eurasian continent, who just completed a trip to the Shanghai Cooperation Council organization meeting of all the Central Asian republics, which just occurred in Tashkent and Dushanbe. Then he went to Maldives, then he went to Sri Lanka, then he went to India. So he met with the new prime minister of the second most populous country on the planet. And the two nations who have fought wars among each other, who still have, while they were meeting in New Delhi, there was a standoff among their troops on the border between China and India. And yet these two leaders were signing deals for economic development for the Eurasian continent. While they were meeting, shortly after they met in India, India became the first nation in the world to successfully launch a spacecraft to Mars on its first attempt, and succeed on its first attempt. Only 40% of the efforts to reach Mars orbit, or land on the surface, have succeeded. No one has been able to succeed on their first attempt. India just did that, okay? And they're planning more. You look at the transformation in China of their own physical economy, their ability to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and they have the maglev. They built the maglev. They have the only functioning maglev train in the world. They have water projects. They have, I mentioned the moon rover. They're about to launch a new space station, just as the International Space Station starts to disintegrate and goes out of existence, right? And everywhere Xi Jinping goes, he speaks about this question of like when he was in Germany, he spoke about Schiller and the great contributions to human civilization made by German culture, which was also inspired by Chinese culture, right? So you have a new type of thinking on the planet, right? Which has been the kind of thinking that LaRouche has been talking about for more than 40 years. We passed out the little article, which when you go to the website, you can look at the original writings going back 40 years. where you see that LaRouche has been talking about the need to bring this new type of relationship among nations into existence for the last 40 years. At the time when LaRouche was still was talking about this, Mao Zedong was still in power in China, which was an anti-progress regime. Okay, so the world has changed quite a bit during these last 40 years, right? And what LaRouche has been fighting for during this whole period is exactly this policy. The specific aspects of the program change over time, but what hasn't changed is the commitment to this principle to bring about a new condition for man. Now, I think just in thinking about that, that poses what the real challenge is here. Because how do you stay stubborn to your principles, but at the same time be able to change your thinking? And people oftentimes confuse being stubborn to principle and being willing to change your thinking. They think being stubborn to principle is the same, not changing your thinking is the same as being stubborn to principle. But being stubborn to principle is different than sticking to old ways of thinking. Because how do you know what's principled? You don't know what's principled. You have to, well, to know what it means to be stubborn to principle, you have to be able to draw on the ideas of, you have to be able to live with the paradox that that Nicholas of Cusa called unlearned ignorance, which is being able to know that your knowledge at any one moment is imperfect, but that your knowledge becomes less imperfect as you advance and imagine and bring into existence new states of organization existence which don't currently exist. I think you can get at that. One way to get at that thought, which I know probably sounds somewhat abstract, is to again review how we got to the state that we're in right now. Because we're facing right now, as I say, a collapse of a system of social organization of mankind, which came into existence really beginning around the time of the European Renaissance, in the 15th century European Renaissance. In that period, we had lived through a period where the entire world financial system, or the financial system of Europe, had completely collapsed. And the collapse was accompanied by an economic crisis similar to the one we're facing right now, but not as bad, in which virtually half the population of Europe was wiped out in a 3-year period. In some cities and towns, more than 80%. Most of that was due to disease, the plague. But the plague had been around for centuries. Why did it wipe out so many people at that time? Because the ability for the system, the European system, to sustain human life collapsed. And it collapsed because it had been based on this system of empires that LaRouche referred to, which goes all the way back to the beginning of mankind. The system of empire is premised on the idea that there is really no difference between man and other animals. And that therefore, that man cannot change the way he thinks. Man cannot change the future. This is expressed, for example, in the cosmology of the imperial system, which held that the Earth was at the center of the universe, not just the solar system, but the center of the universe, and that the Earth didn't move. And that nothing really, even though all around you you see change on the Earth, nothing really fundamentally changes. You're born, you change, and you die. And so all this change is simply a transitory state to a state of no change. And that when you look at that is what your eyes tell you about the nature of the universe, is that as you get further away from the Earth, things start to change less and less. So that on Earth, things change around you all the time, but all that changes for naught. As you get further from the Earth, when you look at the moon changes, but not as much as things on the Earth. You get further from the moon and you look at the planets, and they change, but not as much as the moon. And you get beyond the moon, the planets, and you get to the stars. And they don't change hardly at all, but they move over they never change their relationship to each other, but they move over the course of the night. And then beyond anything you can see, nothing changes at all. This was the cosmology of the imperial system. And if you want proof of it, just go out and look at the sky. You can see it with your very eyes, right? And therefore, we have to have a form of society which most appropriately approximates what your eyes tell you the universe does. Now, there's a little trick there, because what your eyes don't really show that, but the imperial system convinces you that that's what you're seeing. And so therefore, they use that trick to tell you, well, that's the kind of society we have. The best form of society is the one that changes least. So you have to have something that doesn't change in society, and that's the will of the emperor. Nothing can change. The emperor is always all-powerful. The system is all-powerful. The only thing that can possibly change anything is the will of the emperor, and that's completely arbitrary, because he can decide what to do whatever he wants. And in that respect, he's no different than God, who doesn't change anything except when he wants to do something crazy. So if you want change in the world, you just have to pray that God will do something crazy. And if you think about the organization of society that these imperial systems exemplify, that organization of society is one in which everybody knows their place. You do what your father did, and your kids do what you do. You stay on the land, you're always going to be a slave. You owe your existence to somebody with more power than you, and he owes his existence to somebody with more power than him, and everything stays in his place. You can, of course, you can think about other conditions, but those are just fairy tales. They're never going to come to existence. Now, that concept of man and society and the cosmos is so fraudulent that it always collapsed. If you look at the history of the imperial system, you see that empires rise and fall. And they don't really ever rise. They just end up getting absorbed by another empire. But they always collapse. The history of mankind for millennia was a little bit of progress and a lot of collapse. A little bit of progress and a lot of collapse. A little bit of progress and a lot of collapse, right? Well, this thing completely collapsed in in the European system at the end of the 15th century. And in that moment of collapse, there were a few people who were able to change the way they think. And the key person there is who I already mentioned, Nicholas of Cusa. And Cusa developed the idea that the cause of that collapse was not, that there was not a cause of the collapse other than the problem with the system itself. And we had to create a new system. If you wanted to change the condition of man, you had to improve the powers of the mind. If you wanted to change the physical conditions of man, you had to change the way he thinks. And he found enough collaborators, great artists, great scientists, great thinkers like Brunelleschi, like Leonardo da Vinci, like Machiavelli, who demonstrated what the power of the human mind was. And you had a tremendous increase in the application of the powers of the human mind in the form of increases in science and technology, which led to, if you look at a chart of population, which LaRouche has often referred to a dramatic increase in the ability to sustain human life on this planet. If you look at the population from ancient times, you see very, very slow growth until the 15th century. And then boom, it takes off. And the reason why it takes off is not because there was some new physical condition. The reason why it took off is because people finally realized that if you want to improve the condition of man, you have to improve the way he thinks. And this was facilitated by great art, great science, education, and so forth. But this was accomplished in a compromise with the imperial system, which has continued to exist to this day. And the other improvement that occurred right at that moment was a new shift in the social organization, the idea of government that LaRouche was referring to. Prior to that, the only form of government was the one that was accepted by the emperor, a fixed system which could only be changed by the arbitrary will of the emperor. Cusa posed the provocative idea that the best form of government is that which is based on the consent of the governed. But, he said, the problem is the number of fools is infinite. So, if you get a government which fools consent to, you're going to get a foolish government. So how do you organize society on the basis of the consent of the governed unless the government that they consent to is one which will inspire them to change the way they're thinking and not become fools? So out of this grew the concept of the modern nation state, in which you could organize society around in an area of common culture, language, and so forth, that would provide a basis by which individuals could participate in the advancement of their culture through this institution of the nation state. And the nation state was founded on the principle of the common good. The first nation state was in France under Louis XI, in which he actually suppressed the power of lesser nobles and unified it into a new nation based on the idea that the king's responsibility was not to protect the power of the nobility, but was to promote the common good. The second nation state in that regard was the nation state of in England under Henry VII, who had a similar approach. And the empire system at that point shifted from an imperial system that was based on organization around land areas, and became an imperial system based on organization around financial matters. This originated in Venice and then emerged in Holland, and then later took over England with the Glorious Revolution. Then there was a new form of nation state which was organized here, starting here, right here, in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was not only based on the common good, but was based on the idea, as Lincoln later put it in the Gettysburg Address, based on a proposition, based on an idea. So it was a nation state not based on a language group or a geographical region or some long-time culture, but it was based on a proposition which the Founding Fathers said was a self-evident truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they formed a government whose purpose was for the common good and to promote the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to the future. So that was a new advance of a new form of nation state, which was actually based on an explicit enunciation of the idea. But think about this for a minute. Was that formation of that nation's, of those ideas, actually self-evident, as they declared? It wasn't. When they said we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, it was not self-evident in the 18th century. Most people didn't believe that at all, including, as we know, many of the people who were involved in that, like Thomas Jefferson, who certainly didn't believe that all men were created equal, right? But they were bringing about a future condition of man based on an idea which only a small number of people thought. That is, they were building a nation and an idea whose acceptance required changing the way people think. Right? So they were resting the foundation of a new nation on an idea which required people to, which people didn't have. They had to organize the thinking of the world to accept the possibility of an existence of a new state of mankind that had never existed before, right? But since that time, we have been stuck because the imperial system still exists on this planet. And they actually existed within our own country. And when you look at the history of the United States, you see that the history of the United States shows that for much of our history, much of our country has been under the control of this imperial system, which our country was founded to oppose. Right? And we've survived because at crucial times in our history, we've been able to bring forth leadership which has inspired the people of the country to go beyond the way they currently think, right? You know, look at Lincoln in the Civil War, okay? Lincoln was saying before the Civil War, a house divided cannot stand. It can't be half slave and half free. It's going to be all one or all the other, right? And most people said, why not? Why can't a house divided stand? We've stood divided all this time. We can keep standing. We just have to learn to compromise. We just have to learn to get along. There's nothing wrong with our system. We're just not very good at managing the compromise. And it wasn't until the crisis got so bad that people realized that it was going to be all one or all the other, that they had to decide which one it was going to be. And on the basis of that, Lincoln was able to change the way people think. People did change the way they thought, and they mobilized under his leadership to ensure which it became, which all it became, right? So I think that sort of encapsulates really what the nature of the crisis that we're in right now. We've come to the point where what Lincoln said about the United States is true about the whole world. Mankind cannot exist in this state of empire and some pockets of progress. It has to be all one or all the other. If it doesn't become all free, though, it will fall. But what that fall means is the potential extinction of all mankind. Now, we have a problem in the United States that we have to overcome in terms of the specific problem that we're dealing with, the way people think. And again, I refer back to this long paper that LaRouche, that you have that goes through LaRouche's history. Well, one thing about LaRouche's history that most people here are old enough to remember, because it's not that long ago, which is when in January 2001, shortly before the inauguration of George W. Bush, LaRouche said that the system, the financial system, and the world political system is in a state of final collapse. Final collapse. And the oligarchy, in order to stay in power, will move for dictatorship in the United States for the purpose of securing a dictatorship of the oligarchy all worldwide. And they will do this through a terrorist incident similar to the Reichstag fire in Germany in 1933. When Hitler was elected to power in January 1933, he orchestrated the Reichstag fire in March and used that as a pretext to establish a dictatorship and stayed in power until 1945, the end of World War II, under a complete dictatorship, okay? What happened then? Well, you know what I'm talking about, 9/11, right? And we now know, as it's been, LaRouche said at the time, on the day, September 11, 2001, LaRouche was being interviewed on a radio station in Salt Lake City, but it was broadcast all over the internet while it was unfolding. And LaRouche said, this is exactly what I've been warning about. I didn't know that it would take this particular form, but this was carried out by agencies outside the United States and within the United States for the purpose of securing a dictatorship. And from that moment on, we have lived under a dictatorship in the United States. And what has governed that dictatorship, sure, it hasn't had exactly the same form as Nazi Germany, but then technology has advanced, right? You don't have to have the Gestapo spying the way they were doing. We now have the NSA. we have, you know, we know what the revelations are that have come out about the NSA. You have war. We've had nothing but perpetual war since that time, right? Now we're about to start a new war. You've had you know, Bush, the re-election of Bush, the election of Obama, the re-election of Obama, who has perpetuated the very same policies that were under Bush. Exactly the same. In fact, he's gone even further. He's had more war, more spying, more torture, more police state measures than you had under Bush. Okay? So this has just been one continuation after another. And what has characterized the thinking of the American people has been, we live in a police state, so therefore the best you can hope to do is to keep your nose clean, keep your head down, stay out of trouble, go along with it. You're allowed now freely to, you know, speak out against it, but you're not allowed to do anything against it. Look at our elected officials. You know, why are they so cowardly? This cowardice and fear has gripped our country to the point where people don't feel they can resist. They just have to go along with it. We had the financial collapse in 2008. They bailed out the banks. Everybody hated it. Conditions of life got worse for most people. We all complain about it, but it goes on, right? You put, you know, Barack Obama in there. When Bush was president, we said impeach Bush and Cheney, and the Democrats defended Bush. You get Obama in there, and we say impeach Obama, and the Republicans defend Obama. Okay? I mean, is John Boehner any different than Nancy Pelosi was under Bush when she took impeachment off the table? The people were screaming to impeach George Bush. The Democrats defended him. You put Obama in there, and the Republicans defend him. So that you have this sense of despair and fear and hopelessness in the United States because of this dictatorship, right? If this continues, this will only lead us to disaster. But when you look around the world in the early period, most countries were also frightened. But at some point in the recent period, because of this thing that LaRouche has done, LaRouche, of course, is the only one in this whole period who was out front, ahead of the way people were thinking, right? When LaRouche first said we got to get rid of Obama in April 2009, very, very few people with us. Now, the majority of people are with us, but do they really want to do it, right? Where are they now? They're not with us. You know, but LaRouche has been out in front, standing up to this, and other countries are have taken steps to say, well, we're not going to be part of this. We're going to go our own way. China has gone through a transformation. China has said, we're not going to capitulate to this dictatorship. We're not going to buy into this system. Had they bought into the system? Yes. Look at the whole free trade policy and cheap labor policy that China had submitted to for decades.
Yeah.
But they made a change in the way they were thinking. They made a change in their policy. And they put their human capacity, the creative powers of their people, and they fostered them, they developed them, they encouraged them. They sent their young people all over the world to learn science and technology. And now, new scientific breakthroughs that don't occur in the countries where their students study occur in China. Breakthroughs in technology and science and understanding of biology are occurring in China. Original ideas are coming out of China, where they're not coming out of here. You have scientists from the United States, North America, and European countries who are going to China to do advanced research, because you can't do advanced research in our country, because you can't get the money, you can't get the grants, you can't put forward new ideas, right? And you see the same thing in India. India has a little bit more to overcome because they have the vestiges of the colonial system and the bureaucracy and so forth. But out of this really stifling civil service and colonial system, you know, you've had emerge a new leader in India, Narendra Modi, who is looking to the future. He made a speech in which he said 65% of the Indian population is under the age of 35. So we have to think about the future. And the future is not a continuation of the past. The future has to be new ideas, new technologies, new capabilities. And they're working with China. You have the whole developments around the BRICS countries. You have what Argentina is doing in defiance of the IMF and World Bank system, in which the judge in New York and the bankers say you have to pay the debt, and Argentina is saying no, we're going to go to a new system. You have what Russia's doing, which is signing deals with China and India and Argentina. And so the decaying empire system says, well, we're gonna have a fight with Russia over the Ukraine. So they orchestrate that pretext. You get an increase in tension, and literally to the point of really threatening nuclear confrontation between NATO and Russia. They put on these sanctions, and what does Russia do? They've made a deal with China to get all their fruits and vegetables, with Argentina to get their meat. They're trading gas for technology with China. So these countries in the world have said, we're not going down with this old system. We're creating a new system. We're setting up new financial arrangements. And this is not an exclusive system, but they're inviting the whole world to become part of it, including us. And Helga LaRouche, as you know, went to China the end of August, beginning of September, for 2 weeks, where she participated in some very important conferences and public events, media events, and so forth, where she met with the top leaders in China And these people are saying, these ideas that we're operating on are your ideas. The idea of the Silk Road came from you. So think back again to January 2001, and LaRouche is saying we have to replace this old system with a new system because the old system is going to go into dictatorship. And we didn't listen to LaRouche in the United States. We capitulated to the existing system out of fear. Thank God other countries decided to listen to LaRouche, to bring into existence this new system. And they are not going to stop. They're not going to reverse. They will not go back to capitulating to the old system. They're stronger than they've ever been. They've made the decision and they said, this is the world that's open for us. So the question for us in the United States is to free our nation from this dictatorship and bring it into alliance with this new system. Because this new system is based on our ideas. It's our tradition. It's ironic that, you know, the Chinese government is more American than the American government right now. And that's really the truth, right? So, and this was brought about not by some mechanical process or some trick. This was brought about by people having the courage to change the way they think. And that's what our mission and our responsibility is in the United States right now. But not to change the way not to say, and this is where I think you have to really think about this, right? Because oftentimes people say, we have to go back to the good old days. We have to go back to the time, like let's go back to Roosevelt's time, right? Roosevelt, sure, there's a lot we can learn from Roosevelt. We should go back to some of the things Roosevelt put in place that we never should have gotten away from. But what we have to do is not go back to the Roosevelt idea alone. We have to do what LaRouche said. Not try and go back to the old idea of a nation state in the old way, but a new way, which is based on the principle which brought the nation state into existence in the first place. The principle of organizing human society and human culture around the common interests of mankind. And if you allow yourself to actually begin to think about that objective and that possibility, imagine it. Don't say it can't happen. Don't say it isn't happening, or I hope it will happen. But allow yourself to imagine it, right? And allow yourself to have the passion, like LaRouche has, to bring that into existence. And from there, it's obvious. Obama's got to go. This Congress has to go. All the things that we have to do to straighten out our country are really easy from there, right? All the things we spend most of our time arguing about with people, right? You know, are really, you know, puny. They're not really, they don't really exist. But you're not going to get people to deal with these little things by arguing with them about the little things. You're going to get them to realize that these little things are really little, because they don't think they're little, they think they're big. You got to get them to realize that they're really little things by imagining something that's really big, which LaRouche just had the passion and courage to tell us, which is, let's bring about a new condition of man in which man actually understands his role on the planet and the cosmos as the common interest of mankind. And when you let that sink in and you think about what's coming out of China, what's coming out of India, what's coming out of these other countries, you see that other nations have got the buck. They're thinking about it, right? And so you can actually, we're not envisioning something that is far off. We're envisioning something that's right at our fingertips. And what we have to do is really fight to change the way we think so that this new paradigm is what guides us and not the old one. So that's what I had to say, and let's have some discussion. Go ahead.
Tell us more about the influence of the other galaxies on our present condition of perhaps climate change.
Well, I can tell you a little bit because we probably don't know very much about it.
I know nothing about it. It's new
Well,
to me.
Well, what we know is this, and we don't know a lot, right? But here's what we know. Let's start with Kepler, okay, Johannes Kepler, who lived at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. He was alive at the beginning of when the nation state was just coming into existence because the oligarchical system had plunged Europe into 100 years of warfare. The last 30 years was this 30 years war. So the world was falling apart, right? And Kepler realized that the reason why the world was falling apart was because of the implications that I discussed of this imperial system, which was justified by this imperial cosmology, the Ptolemaic system, right? But his point was not that the argument was not whether or not the Earth was at the center or the sun was at the center of the solar system. Because Copernicus said the sun was at the center of the solar system. But Kepler criticized that because Copernicus just changed the position of the sun and the Earth, but kept the fundamental precept of the Ptolemaic system which was that you can derive a mathematical model to explain what you see, but you can never know what is the reason that this is true as opposed to some other thing is true. That is, you can make a mathematical model that puts the Earth at this as a planet and the sun at the center, and come out with the same results as if you had the Earth at the center and the sun moving around the Earth. But you could never tell which was true because you can't see it. There's no way you could ever see, even if you could travel off into space and see whether the Earth is moving or the sun is moving. Because even if you were very far off in space where you could see, that big a distance, the sun would be so bright that you wouldn't be able to see the Earth anyway. So you could never actually test this by sense perception. But you could know it because you have the power of hypothesis, the power of the mind, to imagine the cause of this system, this phenomena, and as a result he developed what was the basic concept of universal gravitation. That is, he said, it's not a question of what you see, but the cause of the motion of the planets around the sun is based on an idea. He used the Latin word species. That's what he called gravity, was a species, which is the Latin word for the Greek word idea, which meant that there's a concept of organization of the solar system, and that the Earth was didn't just appear to move, the sun didn't just appear to move around the Earth, and I interpret that as the Earth moving around the sun, but that there was actually a principle of organization, which he called gravity, that actually moved the planets, which was not a physical interaction, but it was a physical force, a physical principle. Okay, he was saying that because prior to Kepler, just to sort of fill in the hole here, Aristotle had insisted in the physics was accepted that the only way a material body could be moved was by another material body, right? But the planets appear to be moving, or in the case of whether you accept the sun moving or the earth moving, they're not in contact with any other material body. So Kepler said, well, but that's not the way motion works. Things are not moved by another material body. Things are moved by ideas. And so he understood that there was a congruence between the way the human mind works and the universe, the way the universe as a whole works. And he accepted this, he understood this in religious terms, but not necessarily as a religious faith, right? Not as a blind faith. But the idea that God would not have given man the power of creativity and imagination and not have created the universe in the same way. He said, it's as if nature is imitating art. So if we think about the way the mind works and we look at the universe, we'll see that the universe is congruent with that. The mind, you have an idea, okay? What's the weight of that idea? How much does it weigh? How big is it? What color is it? How much energy is it? Those questions are meaningless, right? Because the idea is totally immaterial. It's a thought. It occurs in a brain, which does have weight, you know, all the attributes of physical, of material things. But the idea is not a physical thing. It's a completely immaterial thing. And yet it's the immaterial idea which actually organizes all the physical processes in the universe. We create new forms of matter which don't exist without being ideas. Like the simple one is bronze, right? You don't find bronze in the earth. You find copper, but it's never alone, it's in a rock, right? And you find tin, but it's also in a rock. And we extract it out of the rock and put it together and make a new substance which doesn't exist, right? Now what made that? The physical things or the idea, the thought in the mind, which is immaterial, which creates new forms of material organization. So Kepler understood that that's the way that the universe works. And he was looking at the solar system because that's basically what was known at the time, that the solar system comprised the whole universe. Now we know that there's a whole lot of solar systems out there. And there's not only, you know, in solar systems, there's a whole lot of galaxies out there, you know, systems of systems and so forth. So we know that our Earth is in a solar system, but the solar system is in a galaxy. And the solar system is changing its position relative to the other stars and or solar systems in that galaxy. What we know, what we believe, from best knowledge, right, is that our galaxy is a spiral galaxy. We don't really know how many arms it has, we suspect. But that might not be a fixed number anyway, because it may be changing, right? And there's a certain, that all these stars in the galaxy are in a certain plane. They're not sort of like in a beehive, they're in a plane. But they're not in a completely flat plane, they're like our solar system. Some things are inclined relative to others. And that our sun and solar system moves through the plane up and down the plane of the galaxy as it moves through the galaxy. So one hypothesis is that if you compare the adduced position of the solar system relative to that plane of the galaxy, and you compare that with the fossil records, you find that there's a correlation between the position of the solar system in the galaxy and the number of species that are existent on Earth at any one time, indicating a certain correlation between the position of the solar system and the forms of life that are sustained at any one epoch over the course of geological time. there's a whole lot of other interesting things that this raises, because we had thought that the galaxy was a collection of stars. And we accept the fact that around a star there's a certain electromagnetic field as well as a gravitational field. But that these are all contained in the individual stars. We now have a lot of evidence that there exist galactic electromagnetic fields, which is not the sum of the individual magnetic fields of the stars, but a large-scale electromagnetic structure which governs the interaction of the stars in the galaxy. So there are all those kinds of things, and how that affects, for example, the amount of cosmic radiation that is actually entering the Earth's atmosphere that gets through is all changing and so forth. There's factors, more localized factors, between the sun, the activity on the sun, and climates on Earth. The sun goes through cycles of heightened and lessened activity, sunspots and flares and those kinds of things, which tend to be in 11-year cycles. They go from maximum to minimum and so forth. But we're getting the current cycle, when we're supposed to be at a maximum, is actually a weaker maximum than we've had in a long period of time. And that's probably having a big effect on the Earth. So, you know, there are all these factors which affect, we know from looking at this fossil record, which affect the more immediate climate conditions, for example, on the planet. And like we know from the fossil record that the last 200 years on the west coast of the United States has been relatively wet compared to what the geological record shows from the previous 2,000, 3,000 years, right? So, but, you know, the last 200 years is when when we started populating that region of the continent, right? So what we're accustomed to as being the normal condition on the west coast may be a very abnormal one. You get that much water and rain. So these are the kinds of questions which you really have to study and investigate, but those are the determining factors in these questions. And if we're going to be able to deal with these problems like we have out in the southwestern United States, that's the direction we have to go. LaRouche was asked about this recently on one of these webcasts, and he says, if you want to solve the drought in California, you better talk to the Chinese, because they're starting to think about these things. You can do certain things with water projects and so forth, right? Desalination, maybe to get some immediate relief. But that's not going to be a solution unless we understand these deeper questions. And that's not going to be solved by one nation, because this is a global effect. So you have to have the common interests of mankind unified to put scientific and creative thought into solving those kinds of problems. These are things, this is the way we have to become accustomed to thinking. If we become accustomed to thinking this way, you see all these political problems which seem to be insurmountable really disappear. What possible conflict do we have with China or Russia or India or any country? The real threat we face for existence is these kinds of problems, which is the same threat they face. And, you know, we had an asteroid hit Chelyabinsk, right? A difference of, you know, 1/10 of a degree or a few seconds could have made that asteroid hit New York City. So that you can't have, you know, national asteroid defense.
You're working on it.
Well, if you're going to have an asteroid defense, you gotta go out and stop them, right? And the whole world has to be involved.
Nudge
in
them.
Yeah, well, that's one
50
idea.
years out.
Yeah, so you've got to find them. You got to have early warning. You can't say, oh well, there's one coming, it's going to hit. You know, in 10
We
days.
had one last week within 24,000 miles that they didn't discover it until 2 days before it passed.
Exactly. So how are you going to solve that? That's not a national problem. That's a human problem, right? So, you know, you just see how the thinking changes, right? As soon as you start thinking about these things, you say, what conflict is there between the United States and China? Is there really are they really, what's the word they use? Not rivals, right? Are they a rival? Do we need an Asia pivot in order to keep China under control? I think we need a galactic pivot. That's really important. But you see, it's really a mindset. That's the thing that you really have to think about. How you know, you come to these conclusions about what you think are inevitable fixed sets of relationships when you think they're fixed because you're not thinking you're not thinking about the big picture. And that's what's so exciting about the current thing. Like Helga reported when she came back from her trip to China. You know, you sit down and she said, you know, you talk to very prominent, high-level people in China, and they're not arrogant. They're not like, you know, when you guys go to a congressional town meeting, you talk to your congressman, you know, the guy's arrogant as hell.
Exactly.
They're so arrogant, and they talk down to you, and they're so smug, right? But they're not arrogant. They'll want to talk about solving problems. So you can taste a new condition of mankind if you start thinking about it. Yeah, you have a question.
In your talk, around the end of the 15th century, the imperial system more or less had collapsed economically and politically. And there was a resurgence of the Promethean influence in humanity. And I'm not sure if I heard it right, but I thought you said there was some kind of compromise from the oligarchy about allowing this to happen. So I don't know.
Well, go ahead.
First of all,
Yeah.
First, is that right? And if it is, were they totally altruistic, or was there some long-term agenda that they had for somehow co-opting that as well?
Well, that's a good point. What happened was not that they allowed it to happen, but they couldn't stop it from happening, right? And and so and there was a very small number of people, right, who led this. Like the key guy was Nicholas of Cusa, who was a cardinal in the Catholic Church, right? And he fought with the dominant bureaucracy of the church against the dogma, because the church had become completely ossified with Aristotle, right, and infiltrated by the oligarchy. And they kept people under control by saying, you have to accept these as articles of faith and fixed beliefs, right? And if you read his book, if you haven't read Learned Ignorance, you should get a copy and read it. It's a lifelong study because it's really provocative. It's not that long. It's not lifelong because it takes a long time to read. You can read it in a day, but it's a lifelong study because you keep coming back to it because the ideas are so provocative, right? But what he coaxes out is this sort of very difficult to articulate concept, which is of learned ignorance, that our knowledge of the world becomes less imperfect. It's what he called negative theology, right? You can't say God is X, right? But you say we can never know God, but our knowledge of him becomes less imperfect. Our ignorance becomes more learned by knowing how much we don't know and focusing on the process by which our minds change. It's a long thing, but he was the key. He was key in articulating this, and it was his efforts were aided by a really incredible genius named Brunelleschi, who was artist, an architect, thinker, political organizer, who organized the construction of the dome on the church in Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore, which was they had built in the 100 years before a huge church. And they got the church built, but then they didn't have a roof on it, right? And the church was bigger than any church that had ever been built. And they didn't know how to put a top on it. And he developed the concept, which was a very profound concept of physical science, to be able to construct a dome over that church, which was self-sustaining. That is, it didn't have scaffolding to hold it up like previous domes had to have. So it was not only the largest dome, but it was also physically awe-inspiring because it was self-standing. So the ordinary people saw this accomplishment. It had the effect on the minds of the ordinary people that the Apollo program had to our generation, right? That it demonstrated not just that you could build a dome this big, but it demonstrated that the mind can conquer what appears to be limitations in physical space, right? And it was awe-inspiring from outside and inside and so forth. So the oligarchy regrouped, and they knew they couldn't turn back the clock and undo what had been done, but they figured they would. But they tried to regain their power, and they used the typical political tricks, like what we've seen in the United States. I mean, how do we get to the point where Roosevelt, resolved the question of, the role of government with the economy, and then that all got completely unraveled within the space of 2 generations, right? So it was that kind of process. What Kuza realized is that was coming, and so he said we have to, he knew, like most people, of the existence of the Americas. And he said, so let's see if we can start a colonization of the Americas. This was before Columbus. And he had a friend, a collaborator named Tuscanelli. And Tuscanelli drew the map based on his discussions with Cuza of the existence of the Americas, and then got it to Columbus, who then used his political skills to be able to get funding from Spain to be able to send the ships to do the colonization. Shortly after they started to do that, then of course the oligarchy got involved in that with the gold and silver, and that became the main basis for the colonization. Until you had the colonizations in North America, which was about 200 years later, which had Kuza's ideas sort of found support in the area of Saxony in today Germany under Gottfried Leibniz, whose students were friends of Benjamin Franklin. And Leibniz had influence also in England, and some of these people from England then came. So the whole idea was to create a nation state based on these ideas, to get as far away from the oligarchy as you could. So it's not that they accepted it, they were too weak to stop it, and as soon as they could get back, and as soon as they could get their feet on the ground, that's what the last 500 years has really been, sort of this war of people struggling to create a new form of government, a new form of organization, and this oligarchical system. And that has colored what we think is possible with nation states, or how we have to organize nation states. But we've never, or in other words of putting it, even though we made a great leap forward for mankind in the Renaissance by establishing the concept of a nation state, we've never had a world in which the nation states had to exist, were able to exist free of an empire, free of an imperial system. So like our country, right? We established our freedom, but as soon as George Washington died, right, the New York bankers, took over. I mean, they killed Alexander Hamilton, And then they took over and they ran the government, with the exception of John Quincy Adams, until the Civil War. And, you know, and then they killed Lincoln, and they ran the government until FDR, with the exception of a few minor exceptions here and there. So, that's why looking back to that period is important to understand how they were thinking about the future, but also from the standpoint of how, you know, I'm glad we played that clip from LaRouche, because this really gets at the most. It's easy to think about how you solve the problems among existing nations, but how do you solve the problem among existing nations? Or how do you organize relations among nations in which no oligarchy exists, no empire exists? We've never done that before. And in a sense, that's what they wanted to do, but they didn't succeed. I mean, they didn't get it done. So we have to figure out we're on the cusp of actually being able to do that. And 500 years is pretty small, right? I mean, it's 1/10 of the time that China's been a nation, right?
Right.
We have a little bit longer lives today, you know, 70, 80, 90 years is not unusual today. It was unusual in the 15th century, but still, our lives are really short compared to the length of human progress. But the thing about those, looking back at their period, is they were thinking in the 15th century about bringing about a new state of existence of man, which, you know, long after they died, it came into existence. So we have to be thinking about this, but we can't wait till long after we die, because these guys now have nuclear weapons. Yeah, you have a question.
My question's more about
Just speak a little louder.
My question's more about the climate change.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, like, the Manhattan Project was like a meeting of great minds, like, you know, Richard Feynman and people like that. And so, do you think that climate change would be solved by another meeting of great minds, like international meeting? Is that possible?
Well, I don't think we have to solve climate change. I mean, the climate is going to change. Okay, it's not going to be changed by man, you know, using less carbon. That's not causing our shift here.
Well, it's more. I was like, problem with climate change more of how we are dealing with it and ways we can live more.
Yeah, well, I think we do have to have great minds, but you know, the Manhattan Project, you know, you stuck a bunch of guys off in the desert.
I was using that as an example of a great gathering. And so, do you think that a big gathering of international scientists would help advance ideas to be more?
Yeah, but why think about one gathering of, you know, what I'm saying is that this new paradigm for mankind is a continuous gathering of great minds.
Yeah.
Right? We can organize society now if we allow ourselves to do it, right? Where the cooperation among people on the planet is great minds solving great problems.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It can be everything we do, like the whole of mankind could be one great Manhattan Project.
Yeah.
Continuous, with no beginning and no end. Just mankind is always just working together to solve these big problems.
Yeah. Well, I was saying, well, the rest of the question was that, and do you think that the first step to doing that is to changing the way everybody is thinking?
Well, it's not the first step. It has to happen, right? But yeah, you got to change the way we think. But we really do have to bring this into existence. We're not starting from scratch here. Okay. There's already big changes happening in the world. In that handout, you can see 40 years of LaRouche's fight for this. You know, it's funny. You go back and you'll read these things, right? Like the things he put out 40 years ago. 40 years ago, you know, China, as I said, Mao Zedong was still in power in China. Okay? You know, the third world was really, there was no science and technology. Things were really collapsed. The United States and Europe were stuck in this, in the Cold War, right? Between the United States, the world was completely different. And yet, you look at those things and you see that the ideas that LaRouche was putting forward there were the same ideas we're talking about now. they've changed because the situation has changed. Now there's a different climate, that India is a powerful scientific leader right now. China is a powerful scientific leader. These countries are stronger. So we're beyond the first steps. Right?
The next step would be the process.
Yeah. Well, but that's always the step you have to take. To bring about a future, you have to imagine something which doesn't exist. Right? You know, when a great scientist makes a discovery, at the moment he makes a discovery, he knows something everybody else doesn't know. He's thinking in a way that's different than everyone else. He's thinking right, and everyone else is thinking wrong. Imagine yourself if you understood something that you knew that the way everybody in the world, everybody on this planet was thinking was completely wrong. You knew something they didn't know. I mean, that's how mankind survives, right? Because fortunately, somebody shows us that the way we're thinking is wrong. Otherwise, you'd never have progress, right? Right? I mean, that's how mankind survives, right? Otherwise, we'd still be, you know, where would we be? We wouldn't be men. We wouldn't be human beings, right? It's always one guy, one person, who realizes, hey, everybody around me is totally stupid because they don't seem. And I used to be stupid too. So that's what it means to be human. What it means to be human is being able to say, yeah, I was stupid and now I know something better. You know, that's what makes it fun. And we have to have a culture in which that's the culture that's what we're happy about, right? And that's why you have like great artists, great, you know, music and poetry, because that always, you know, holds a mirror up to you and gets you to laugh at yourself, at your own stupidity, even if it's something very serious, you know. And that's how progress occurs. It's what it means to be human. We haven't been acting like humans. We've been going back like before Prometheus, where we're proud of what we know. Why should you be proud of what you know? You know, probably half the stuff you know is completely wrong. So let's be proud of the ability to change the way we think. And that's the fun part. And that's the cultural change, right? It's hard to, like, for example, you know, back when John Kennedy said, you know, we're going to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. And we hadn't even gotten a rocket up. I mean, most of our rockets were blowing up. So for the President of the United States to say we're going to send a man to the moon on a rocket and get him back to Earth, that was like not just something that hadn't been done before, it was like something nobody thought could ever be done. Right? And when that man, Neil Armstrong, took that first step on the moon in 1969, something like 80% of the world's population saw that live on their little televisions, you know. You could have been out in a little village in India or somewhere and there were 200 people gathered around a little flicker of TV showing. So that's what I'm talking about. That being the culture of man, that being what we strive for, what we educate ourselves to be, what we educate our kids to be. You know, teachers today, they educate the kids to repeat after them, right? You don't want that. You want to educate a kid to, you know, sass you back and say, yeah, well, that's the stupidest thing you ever said. You want your kids to be smarter than you, right? Otherwise, you're never going to make any progress. Yeah.
At the very end of the video, you mentioned something about government, not government as a means, but as a purpose.
Yeah.
Could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is the really provocative idea, is to think about it, because we've sort of been, especially since this 9/11 problem, sort of had this idea that you somehow need government to keep people under control. You need government. We're not talking about anarchy, but what is the purpose of the government? I mean, I think the American system is so far the best expression of it, which is the purpose of the government is to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, right? So you want the government, and has to be sort of the inspiration in society that protects and fosters the creative powers of the individual minds. Because an individual person who makes a discovery, the discoveries are always made by individuals, right? An individual comes up with a new idea. But that individual, first of all, didn't gain the capability to come up with that new idea by him or herself. You gain that capability because a whole history came before you of cultures, generations and generations and generations.
And so the concept of ownership then of that new idea would be global ownership.
It's an interesting thought, right? Because you get this very provocative relationship, right?
As opposed to putting a monetary value on that.
There's no monetary, right?
It would be globally.
Well, the point is,
spread out.
yeah, that's true. I mean, the problem is that so much of our society is organized around money and thinking about money. But, don't worry about the mechanism, but think about the process as it occurs, right? If you just think about how do ideas perpetuate across generations, right? There are ideas which we hold as commonplace ideas now, which took generations of struggle to actually come into fruition, right? So we're dependent as individuals. When you're born, you don't know anything, right? So your culture, through your culture you assimilate all the good and bad things that you are educated about from past generations. You're here for a certain amount of time. And what you contribute to that culture, for good or ill, is going to perpetuate after you're gone, right? So you're going to do something unique in your life, hopefully, and what you do is going to not be owned by you, because if it's good, if it's a new discovery, it's going to be perpetuated through all mankind into the future. So you have this relationship where it's a paradoxical thing, where the individual, the individual has to be free to be able to develop a new idea that is not accepted by popular culture. On the other hand, in order to be able to do that, you have to be assimilated into a culture. And that's the way we have to learn. People have to learn to think, right? You're doing something for mankind, past, present, and future. And that's what we have to organize our governments to defend and support and to foster. The mechanism of government is not the issue. You don't regulate that by laws. You don't regulate that by rules. You need laws and you need rules. And you need order. But you need that in order to be able to perpetuate freedom. And there's no formula for it. And
well, I do believe there's a formula. I believe in the Bible in a Christian fashion, and loving your neighbor as yourself perpetuates.
Yeah, but see
free,
that
you don't put a monetary value on
right.
me loving my neighbor.
No, but that,
see, you're promoting China, and just recently China is ripping crosses off of churches, and 1/3 of China has gone Christian.
Well, but
So
you see, but that idea of
that?
loving your neighbor, okay, also is there in Confucian ideas.
Okay.
So the people who
It's not an original idea.
Of course not, it's an original idea. It's the nature of man, right? Okay? So it exists in different cultures. And this is an important point, because this is a real challenge, right? Because different cultures will have the same idea, but in a different cultural context, right? The oligarchy has used those differences to divide people. And you can learn something from Kuza about this, because there's not a formula for solving this, right? But Kuza wrote an essay, dialogue, called On the Peace of Faith. Okay, it's an imaginary dialogue between a Christian, a Muslim, a Zoroastrian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, all these different religions, right? It's short, but it's very accessible. It's not real abstract, right? And they're all discussing how do we understand each other, okay? Now, when somebody in our culture sees that, they say, okay, how do we learn to agree to disagree, right? And respect each other's disagreements. That's not the way Kuza does it. He says, how do we get to the things that are in our culture that are actually universal? And on the basis of recognizing that universality of what are the most important concepts of our culture in another culture, then we can accept another culture's expression of those if we understand it as being an expression of a universal idea.
So would you agree that loving your neighbor as yourself would be a good start?
Sure. Oh yeah, no, that's
like
and you find it
foundation.
Absolutely, and you find that
putting no monetary value on our talents and
exactly.
freely giving them to
right.
society.
And that's and I'm saying that exists in Confucius. I'm not saying everything is great in China. Okay, they have lots of problems in their culture. They've been they came out of a very dark period of the Cultural Revolution. And before that, they had a very dark period of the colonial.
Well, their government is fearing Christianity because they're tearing down crosses.
Some people are doing,
so
yeah, but that's also
that's a fear factor there.
There's a fear factor there, but then the Pope has said he's willing to go to China and discuss this. Okay, so what if the Pope and Xi Jinping were able to sit down with each other? Right?
The Pope doesn't speak for me. Sorry.
Well, he may not, but I'm just saying that he's a Christian, though. Whether you're Catholic or not, I mean, okay. What I'm saying is that there are certain universal ideas that provide the foundation by which people from very diverse cultures can come to an agreement on what is the essential universality about the direction of man, okay? And if we have that kind of dialogue, the kind of religious strife and conflict which you're describing can disappear. And the 30 Years' War was a brutal, evil war among Christians, right? Who are arguing over dogma, right? They were both Christians, but they were killing each other.
By the millions.
Brutally, right? And in fact, there were Catholics who were backing the Protestants to kill other Catholics for political reasons, okay? So it's not a question of a conflict between Christianity and Chinese culture, right? A lot of evil has been done in the name of, defending religious dogmas.
But most of it has been backed by gold, which backed Columbus,
money,
which backed
well, okay, here's another thing.
Through the church and
right, but here's another
monetary. You're talking gold.
Gold is part of it, but
within the church, which is part of greed, which had nothing to do with the original teachings of Christ or Confucius or whoever else.
Gold and power had a lot to do with it, but I can suggest another study for you, which helped develop this. Is that Friedrich Schiller, who was a poet, he wrote a history of the 30 Years' War. Okay, and then he also wrote a series of plays based on his history, and he examines this question of what motivates people. Like in the beginning of his history, he says, if people say this was a religious war, you'd be wrong, because there were princes who were vying for power and money. He says, but if you were saying it was only a political fight, you'd also be wrong, because you never would have mobilized a single soldier except if you didn't have deep belief in their religion. So it's not as simple as gold and power, but it is corruption of universal principles. And corruption, whether it's within Christianity or within some other culture, is still corruption. And truth is truth, regardless of what language or creed it's expressed in, right? Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is that there may be differences in dogmas or in expressions which are really immaterial, because people who express their beliefs in one way or another can always have a dialogue about what's universal, right? But also, the oligarchy can manipulate that in order to keep people from having that. Right? And that's what we have to rise to.
How about putting that in today's, right this minute's terms, and how we get the world to find some kind of agreement with radical Islamists, and how to get these people to not be killing each other?
Well, first of all, you have to understand what this process is. These are not religious figures. It's religion being mobilized for political purposes, very much like the 30 Years' War. But I mean, look at Egypt right now. Okay, it's a Muslim country, it's an Arab country, and the oligarchy took advantage of a popular uprising there, and
encouraged it.
And encouraged it, and you had the Muslim Brotherhood take power. Mm-hmm. And then the Muslim Brothers were overthrown by a patriotic general who has now put Egypt on a completely different course. Egypt is building a new Suez Canal.
Mm-hmm. Thank God for that.
Egypt is willing to cooperate with all these other countries. So that's the way you deal with it. This radical Islamic fundamentalist is a terrorist movement of convenience that was created by the British monarchy. It's funded by the Saudis. The Saudis are not Muslim Arabs. They're part of the British monarchy. They were created. Saudi Arabia didn't exist as a nation, okay, until the British created it, right? They created it in the end of the 19th century when they switched the power source for their fleet from coal to oil. And then they got together with the French and divided up the region where they thought most of the oil in the world was.
100 years ago.
Yeah, and they used religion as a way to manipulate people. Yeah. But that wasn't a new innovation on the British Empire. That's what the Roman Empire did, right? Manipulating people against each other, divide and conquer, all these things you know about, right? So the radical terrorists and so forth are the cat's paw of an oligarchical movement which is trying to destroy mankind. The problem we've had, the only reason why these things haven't been wiped out, is because we've been supporting them. And that's why, for example, we want to get these 28 pages released. There's 28 pages from the 9/11 report, which would show that the Saudi government, officials of the Saudi government, and officials of the American government, and officials of the British government were in collaboration to fund those terrorists.
So how close are we to getting those released?
I mean, it's I don't know how to answer that, except for the fact that we have to keep pushing on you. You have a congressman here from Massachusetts who's on board with that.
Two.
Yeah.
McGovern signed on to it too.
McGovern and Lynch.
Yeah.
You have Republicans signed on to it. There's, I don't know how many, but they have it there, and 10. So
no, none.
Oh, none.
Republicans.
No, Walter Jones.
Yeah, Walter Jones, a Republican.
The Republican who sponsored it.
Not just Massachusetts.
Oh, none from Massachusetts.
Talking about
Not from Massachusetts.
No, but I'm saying in the Congress as a whole, you have Republicans and Democrats who have both signed on as co-sponsors to this bill, and it could be brought up any time, but John Boehner keeps it, won't let it be brought up to a vote.
He's Obama's best friend.
Well, that's the point.
We're all in bed.
He said so.
And Nancy Pelosi was George Bush's best friend. It's true. So we have to keep fighting?
Yeah,
Brett, you have a question?
Yeah, sort of a question. You mentioned there's a stipulation to changing the way you think. It's not just finding out that this is how you think or this is how you should think. You're not presenting that. What's interesting is the modern atonal composers who hated Beethoven.
Right.
They tried to change the way people thought by introducing new, almost arbitrary rules for composition.
Right.
And what they state is by doing that, they hope to change the motivations and the passions of human beings and their relationship to music. They said experimentally we found by introducing modern forms of rock beats and things like that, we can induce even necrophilia in the individual. Whereas Beethoven says music is the purpose of writing music is to inspire fire in mankind. That's the reason a composer should write music, not to bestialize them. And so I think what you're describing is we're at a time or a moment, a historical moment, where that preference in taste for the creative, that preference in taste for the Beethoven over the Justin Bieber can actually be seized upon by mankind. If you're describing our relationship to that process as offering or making a presentation of a creative idea, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, look, the point is that there was a direct physical attack against what Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart represented, right? And you saw that with the rise of Liszt and Wagner and so forth. But that was not new too. You have the same thing in Greece. Plato rails against the popular artistic forms of the day because they were designed to induce the same conception of man in the population. And it is important. Look at the popular culture today. What does it celebrate? It celebrates and promotes bestiality. It celebrates death. It doesn't foster and encourage and inspire creativity. And I think that's another interesting thing about China. Look at how prominent Western classical music is in China today. They're promoting education, the students, the development of composers and orchestras and musicians and singers and so forth. And I think that the modern art culture, the whole culture, jazz culture, pop culture, and down, is all part of a concerted effort on the part of the oligarchy to destroy the population. I mean, jazz was created because African Americans were denied the talented African American musicians were denied the right to be able to perform classical music in the United States in the end of the 19th century. At the end of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass had a whole program to educate the African Americans in classical music, and that was all shut down, except for small little pockets around.
Miles Davis wanted to play Mozart on trumpet, but they wouldn't let him play it at Juilliard.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was his first passion, was Mozart.
Yeah.
That's why he played to his back to
So
the
was
audiences.
P. Diddy, was educated in classical arts.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, that's what it is. It's what people think today is their culture is not their culture. It's the culture that's been given to them by the oligarchies. And here's your culture. Enjoy it. We're not going to let you have real culture, right? And that's what happened.
But you're describing a culture which is qualitatively different than that, one characterized by creativity, and this is the response to creativity. This is something that is a physical transformation.
Well, look at what you were working on earlier, this Dania. Some people were here for that rehearsal. And that was a musical setting of a poem by Schiller, right? And the poem is actually based on a Greek idea, right? Because Schiller wrote that poem in a classical Greek meter, which is not common to the German language, right? He was the first German poet to really use it. And what is the first line of that poem, right? Even the beautiful must die, which is a very, very poignant thought, right? But it raises the issue we're just talking about. When you just think of how, and the poem unravels that thought using references to Greek mythology and so forth. But the poem unravels that. Why is it that, you know, what does it mean that even the beautiful must die? Right? And what does that cause us to think? And it forces you to think about your own mortality, right? You're here and, you know, you're gonna die. Do you celebrate death? Or do you celebrate and foster the beautiful, which must die, but nevertheless lives on? And in that musical setting, that thought expressed in the poetry is magnified, it's enhanced by the skill with which Brahms sets that to music, which actually, just in the opening choral line where the chorus sings that idea, right? The musical idea raises that to an even higher level, and you just hear those opening lines, and it forces you to emotionally confront that seeming paradox, which is a fact of existence, and yet it's nothing to get depressed about. It's not something where you say, "Oh, the beautiful must die, therefore why have beautiful? Why have beautiful?" You know, it's exactly the opposite. And that's what you come to grips with, right? And that's an emotional question. You have to come to grips with it, but that's, in a certain sense, that's where, I don't know, it's so complex, it's hard to put into words, but the best statement of it is Schiller and Brahms, right? So I don't want to try and reduce it. But that's you know, I mean, for people who are here, the experience of listening to that, of participating in it, of trying to communicate that, is in itself a valuable experience for society to advance, right? If you deny that experience to people, and you give them instead this necrophiliac popular culture, you know, you're turning them into animals. And that's what the oligarchy does. And the demonstration of the power of that idea is that a small experience has a huge effect. Like what you said about Miles Davis, right? If a child is acquainted or allowed at a young age to experience that quality of music, it's going to be a different person. And if you deny that, the worst is what you described. Somebody who's acquainted with it and then told that you can't have it because of the color of your skin.
Same thing happened in the Cultural Revolution.
Exactly. They put all the classical musicians in China in jail. And then after the Cultural Revolution, they let them all out. And now there are more, you know, students of classical music in China than there are anywhere else in the world.
And they excel.
Oh yeah.
What we do.
But we could do that too. I mean, we used to have great musical programs.
We don't do it the same.
No, but there was a time in the United States where in American public school systems, including here in Massachusetts, there were high quality classical music programs, and students graduated from, you had the same thing in Detroit. Some of the greatest opera singers we have came out of the public school system in Michigan. And it was in the public schools, so even if you came from a poor family that couldn't afford lessons or couldn't afford musical instruments, you could get the lessons or the instruments at your school. And money was put into this because, you know, a general, not just a general level of musical literacy was important for society, but you wanted to make sure that any child could catch the bug at an early age and pursue it and be encouraged to pursue it.
And then?
We say, oh, well, that's not important. We need practical thinking.
They need to become finance majors.
Yes. They need to learn how to manage money.
Students, they need to still pension funds for
people. So children were not given, you know, budget cuts, you know. You can't afford it, so let's take the music lessons out of school.
Music is what they took out first.
Yeah. Music and art, which is really important.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
The earlier discussion about needing to learn how to think differently and how to handle problems differently, the lack of the ability to progress and think from their current status is what is considered to be the reason for the gradual extinction of the Neanderthal 30 to 40,000 years ago.
Yeah.
They had a certain level of progress, and although they were our cousins, we never really, as humans, had war with them. We just out-progressed them, out-thought them, out-developed them, and they gradually became extinct.
Yeah, I think that's, as far as we know, I think that's true. Although I haven't
Except for a few that have become Sasquatch and live in our woods.
Well, as a dog lover, I also accept the theory that the reason why humans outlived Neanderthals because we were able to domesticate animals and they weren't.
Right.
And the first animal we domesticated were dogs.
Right.
Yeah. Which we taught to help us hunt. And that's why it's good to own dogs. I won't show you Although my dog thinks that the reason why humans outpaced Neanderthals is because humans allowed themselves to be domesticated by dogs. Because they did this, I'll tell you something funny. They actually did this experiment, right? Yeah. Where with wolves and dogs, okay? And they put the wolves and the dogs separately in a room with a cage and some meat, and they had to pull a lever to get the meat out of the cage, right? But they rigged it so that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't do it. So the wolf would go in there, and the wolf would try, and if it didn't succeed, it would try again. If it didn't succeed, it would try again, and it would try again, and try again, try again, try again. And after about 15 minutes, it would give up. The dog would try once or twice, and then look to its owner. So the key is the dog recognized how to control man. That's true.
You mentioned something in your speech about looking back through archaeology and seeing different places in the earth where there were time periods when more species were actually alive on this earth. You can look also at the places on this earth that are holding large quantities of crude oil and so forth, which are basically what's left after huge amounts of animals and plant life have decayed for a long time. So you take places that are like under the ice in Alaska or northern Canada, under the ice, and there's huge quantities of oil, which means that was a warm area that hosted animals and plant life at one time.
Yeah. Well, there's a famous historian in India named Tilak, who was actually one of the founders of the Indian independence movement, even before Gandhi. He studied the Vedic epics, the ancient hymns from India, which go back
I have that book.
25,000. It's by Tilak, right? The Arctic Home of the Vedas. And he actually said that the people who first wrote those poems lived in the Arctic, which at the time was a warm
zone.
Warm, and then as the Ice Age progressed, they moved south. So, and he did that by studying the...
So global warming is not such a horrible thing. It was way warmer in the past. Way warmer.
Yeah, sure. Way colder.
And also another thing about this is they're concerned about the amount of carbon emissions and so forth. There's a really, I don't understand why people don't know and do something about this. That what trees eat is carbon. Okay? I mean, they store carbon and they emit oxygen. So if we planted okay, everybody go out and plant 100 trees, in every country, we would be done with that.
That's too
why not?
It's
very easy.
No, the global warming thing is just a hoax that's been perpetuated to get people to be pessimistic.
The forest to the North Pole, the taiga forest, the forest that encircles the northern part of the Arctic, absorbs 1/3 of the Earth's carbon. Just this one forest that goes from Lapland and Scandinavia all the way around to eastern Canada. So, and one of Franklin Roosevelt's initiatives when he was president was to plant millions of trees.
We wouldn't have
Trees
the
are
global
great.
warming.
Trees hate solar panels, though. Because they can't grow.
It'll grow up between them.
Determination.
Well, it's also really sad that we have so much deforestation going on in the world instead of forestation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but this is the point. If you have collaboration among nations for, then, you look at these whole areas. I mean, the drier, you have, like Helga, when she went to China, she started off in Lanzhou, which is like central China. And they had a conference on the Silk Road. And then they went on like a field trip for a few days on buses west into the Gobi Desert and then can't remember the name of the other desert. So you have this huge belt of deserts there in Central Asia, which the Chinese and the Central Asian republics are all talking about reforesting, reclaiming the deserts as part of the whole Silk Road program. So, we should be working. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been invited to an event next week, and it's a bunch of local designers, architects, and city planners, and they're talking about rising sea levels. So this is kind of jumping off of what you were just talking about. And their basis for the discussion and the report that they're about to publish is that we have to live with sea level rise. And so they're coming up with a plan about how to reimagine Boston, et cetera, and all these other kind of quote-unquote green things. I think it's a load of bunk. There's also a lot of other engineers that have a very kind of sensible view at this, and they know how to address the situation in, I guess, a little bit more of a logical fashion. And so I think you're right. Like, there's this, I went to an architectural school, the Boston Architectural College, and the green paradigm is very, very pervasive.
Yeah.
Not just there, but I think elsewhere. And any sort of optimism or any sort of consideration of any sort of real solution is really kind of not on the table. For instance, you know, on the website, there's always something about fusion, which is it's exciting, and it gives me chills every time I hear someone talking about this. And it's great because this is the only place that I can hear this. And for years at school, it was always about solar panels and whatnot. But the other thing that I really wanted to bring up was, I think there are opportunities, talking about education earlier, so also in Boston, there's the quote-unquote innovation district. And it's kind of funny because in this innovation district, there's lots of app companies that produce worthless apps, and some other companies are worthwhile. The mayor is interested in pushing this out into the community, so they're working with Roxbury Community College and a number of other organizations, and I just read about this morning. However, when I looked at the list of committee members, the majority of them all work in the financial industry. And it struck me, where's someone from the Boston Symphony? Where's someone from the Science Center? Where's someone from you know, other higher levels of academia? Where's someone from art, the MFA, you know, the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum? So all these other perspectives aren't there. I'll finish up with this. They're trying to promote the STEM program, and I think it's an area of opportunity. I think more and more people are getting interested in the science and technology side of things, but they don't have this perspective that you're talking about. And I think it's much more of a very, very much of a small scale. We have to establish a small little group. We're going to put this program in this school. Great, we're going to have a few kids over here, you know, learning about this and that. But there isn't this grander perspective, and there isn't an optimism that's at the basis for a lot of what the mayor and these other people want to do. So. I don't know, it's this, there's an opportunity, there's also, it's seriously lacking.
Yeah, well, that sort of indicates that we're living in a dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
Where even when people want to do something in the right direction, they feel so constrained that they make it completely under control. And that's why, you know, what we have going with China and so forth is so powerful. And if you go in and organize, that's one thing you can do, is go, if you have an opportunity to go in and talk to some of these people, we should do this, who are involved in this. Say, look, you know, I applaud your excitement about science, technology, but you're thinking too small. Look at what's going on here. Why don't you get part of this movement? And let's really get a movement in the United States for joining this new paradigm. And you know, try and get people to see that. I think that could really, you're not going to, you know, a lot of people are going to be too afraid to think bigger, right?
Sure.
But you're going to find people like yourself who want to think bigger, and you get one or two, and that helps. And then they can support us. I mean, the point is, when you ask, what can you do, right? I could, you know, give you a load of BS and say, well, you can call your congressman, you can do this, but none of those small things are going to work, right? The only thing that's going to work is a big change. And the big change that has to happen is the change which is being affected by our organization. And our movement is precarious. I mean, we're a small group with no money, and you know, we do a lot. We do, like, you know, a huge amount with what little we have. But if people want to do something, they can support us and make sure that these ideas get out. You know, when Helga goes to China, the Chinese say, you know, this came from you. This came from your ideas. there was a good interview, which you can see on CCTV, with Helga being interviewed the last time she was there, about the Silk Road. And it's quite impressive because the guy's interviewing her and talking about the Silk Road. And then on the, on the bottom, where they put like the headline and stuff, they say, Xi Jinping supports the Silk Road. This is China's policy. Wow. So, but I think that's, see if you can get people interested in what we're doing in this movement and joining the LaRouchePAC and the Schiller Institute. And maybe what we should do is think about, at some point in the future, setting up like a conference here in Boston, like a day conference, where we would have on the Silk Road and do an outreach to that. I'm just throwing that out with no authority whatsoever. I'm planting the idea. We might and then, I mean, don't wait for that, but in the meantime, we can approach these people and say, look, here's what we're doing, here's what LaRouchePAC is doing, here's what the Schillers is doing, and, join with us, and, and let's come up with ideas about having this dialogue here on a bigger scale. Because that's it, you're not going to get the majority of people, but you're going to get the ones and twos who, sort of are looking for something, but and they're chafing under the constraint that, like I recently read a book about fusion energy by a prominent fusion scientist from California, and he's an old guy now. He's in his late 80s and stuff. But the first half of the book is about climate change and all this stuff in order to justify why fusion would be a good solution to climate change. It's ridiculous. Why does he waste, out of a 400-page book, it's 200 pages only. And the rest of it is very interesting. We're talking about the progress in fusion energy. But why does he need this long prolegomena paean to the existing dictatorship?
What's his projection as to when we will have fusion that's useful?
He doesn't really make one because he's too constrained. But
it's always 20 years away.
Yeah, it's always 20 years away. But if, I don't think the Chinese are going to wait 20 years.
30 years ago, it was 20 years away.
I mean, if you put a crash program into it, you could get it very, very soon.
Right.
That would be fantastic.
Of course.
We'd all have one on our property.
Yeah.
Take care of all of our needs, wastes, and everything.
Yeah, you could do that.
Yep.
I mean, I think it's the resources for that. Obviously, the more we can get society working on it, the faster we'll get it.
Mm-hmm.
But many feel we don't need it.
Well, that's because they live in a dictatorship. We're only allowed what the emperor will allow. Right. To stop thinking that way. Yeah.
What do you think of labor equity companies, startup companies, as opposed to setting a monetary exchange, labor equity over an idea?
Well, I think those kinds of ideas are the kinds of things you try and do, but the problem is that this whole system is coming down, and I think we've got to. I mean, I don't know how that works. I don't know. I think you can maybe get a start on something like that, but did you really? Unless the whole system is coming down, so you got to get a new system so that people who have ideas can start organizations that will then, get those things off the ground. But I can't say much more than that, because I think if you try and start anything in this collapsing system, the problem is that you have to deal with the system. And that's why, that's why these innovation companies are making apps instead of taking these people and putting them to work doing something, really working on something exciting. If you want to get equity in it's got to be something that somebody thinks they can ultimately make, a huge amount of money very quickly on. Or even if they can't make money on it, at least they can construct some derivative that they can sell on the financial markets that is based on. That's the problem with the system right now. nothing gets done. You know, if you have, like if you look at the original the space program, right? When we set that as a project, that led to a whole bunch of small companies and organizations which both were involved in producing, you know, new things that were needed for the space program, but also then taking the things that were developed and applying them in the broader economy. So you get you get those kinds of things, organize all the little things, the possibility for a whole lot of little things to be able to flourish.
And that's why it's government down, is that what you're saying? Because we as a people supported the Apollo missions and my uncle worked for
Governments have to do the big things, right? Because if you leave it to companies to do the big things, they don't have the resources. But the really, really huge things, you know, you need not just one government, but I mean, right now, you know, there's certain things that a single government can do, like China can do a rover on the moon and stuff like that. But if you really want to have big projects for space development and so forth, you really need you know, multiple governments working. You really need an international effort. And if you had that, then imagine the kinds of spin-offs and innovation which would be.
So privatization recently is a real bad thing.
Oh yeah,
as far as,
it's really
exploration.
Oh yeah. Because you're limited. Privatization is like looking at the past. First of all, privatization is a big joke because all the so-called technologies which are being developed by private companies were all developed really as out of the largely the defense industry. You know, innovations around defense. Because our space program doesn't do much anymore, right? But that's, you know, a private company can take something that's been developed and apply it, but they're not going to develop something that is so completely outlandish, like, you know, sending a man to the moon and bringing him back. Right. That has to be a national mission. It wasn't a government mission, it was a national mission. And so the government defined it as a national mission, and the government did what it had to do to accomplish that national mission. It brought the people together. And that's really it. It isn't the mechanics of it that's important. It was that we had a president who was committed to defining a national mission. That's what he wanted to do with his presidency. He wanted to define national missions. He was an inspiration. You know, he had problems, but he was still an inspirational president who was thinking about where do I get the country for the future. You know, we have these beautiful speeches that he gave where he's, you know, dedicating the dam, and he said, you know, everything that we have came from 40 years ago. What we have to do now is set this course for the next 40 years. So that's the way he was thinking. We haven't had any national missions since then. Our leaders have never set national missions. The closest we came was when Reagan adopted LaRouche's idea for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that got undone very quickly. But you know, if you think about it, in the last 40, since the Apollo project, we haven't really had a national mission, except to go to war somewhere.
The global war on terrorism.
Going back a little bit though, Eisenhower did initiate this national highway system.
Yeah, sure.
That we
well,
had.
that was part of the national, yeah.
Right, that was a real national mission, and it took decades, and part of it was for the military purpose.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's nothing, that's not a problem, right?
No, not a problem,
but
it was a national mission.
Sure. I mean, I was saying, since Kennedy, we haven't really had
Right.
Railroads.
You had Eisenhower, but that's what Roosevelt did.
Yeah.
You know, the TVA and the Bonneville Power Authority and the Hoover Dam, and all these big projects, the rural electrification and so forth. Those were all big national missions, which were done for the purpose of improving the nation.
Right.
And that's what gave us the capability, when the war started, to actually build the infrastructure that we needed for the war. But he didn't start those things for military purposes. He started those things and he didn't start them for make work. He started things because the southeast United States was a disaster because of the lack of flood control in the West. And so in other words, you can define national missions which organize the capability of the nation to the common good. And now we're at a point where we can organize global missions among nations, collaborating for even bigger projects like the Silk Road, right? This is something which involves every nation. And the Chinese are saying that. Everyone's invited to this. Everyone's. And if we get in there, see, the United States right now is becoming irrelevant because we have set ourselves up in opposition to what is relevant to the future of mankind.
Right.
And our economy is going to continue to collapse. The only relevance we have for the future of mankind is that we have enough nuclear weapons, and if we have an idiot like Obama in the White House, we could launch a nuclear war and extinguish mankind.
Yeah, yeah.
But as far as doing good in the world, we're just pissing it away.
I know. Exactly.
So let's stop doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Let's stop doing that.
Yeah.
We're a great country. Let's stop pissing it away. Let's start doing something with it.
Yeah.
I guess that's a good campaign slogan. Stop pissing away the United States.
Well, see, I've been expressing to a friend of mine from South Attleboro, I was trying to get him down here, but forgot it. But I said these nations that are part of the BRIC, are doing exciting things. Like China pursuing killing things on the moon, India's accomplishment of getting that, non-manned mission orbiting around Mars. And, I mean, it's just, all we have to do is impeach Obama.
Yeah.
Is when LaRouche said, get him out of there, and and that's what we got to do to get Glass-Steagall.
Joe Biden. Then we get Joe Biden.
Well, see, this is, but
LaRouche has an answer to that.
Yes, he does. And
what he's saying is that what he is demanding is that Bill Clinton step up to the plate and accept LaRouche's demand that he reorganize the Democratic Party. Clinton could do it. Whether he will or not is another question.
Will he want his wife to be the president then?
Not necessarily. That may not be the result. But he knows what can be done. He's had a collaborative effort with LaRouche over the years. He is smart enough to know that this is the direction that man has to go. And he has the stature to be able to do it. The question is, will he do it? And that's LaRouche has asked him publicly. He said, this is really the one thing that could get it done quickly. But, that's one thing. Yeah, Ryan.
I was just thinking if you could comment on, you brought up the case of this Brunelleschi's creation of the dome with Cathedral of Florence. And I think that's from hearing a couple of presentations on it, reading a few articles about it, it seemed like it was just an astounding accomplishment, both artistically and scientifically.
Yeah.
To organize that many people, to volunteer their labor to create it, and I was thinking how it feels like people in the United States, we feel like we are oppressed by a dictatorship, and we're like you said, there's efforts in a constructive and to make positive contributions, like the STEM program was brought up as one, and then there's these reflections of the American system, both culturally and also scientifically, globally. It's that process disseminated and it took root, and those seeds grew, and conceptually, like the power of the minds of Americans of preceding generations is now taking root and bearing fruit intellectually abroad. And I was just thinking, it's a seeming paradox because we have our very rich, complex cultural and artistic tradition that we are, it defines humanity. And it just seems like you look ahead and what's not yet created in the future, it's kind of scary, right? Because it's empty. there's not a form to it. There's not, the cathedral is not built.
Right.
You know, like what's beautiful, what's going to inspire you when it's created, isn't there to experience. So I was just wondering, you know, it seems like we have to have these conferences. You have to read through. You have to do a lot of study. And you have to have a lot of experience to be grounded in a vision of what you're going to create. Like you said, we need a big solution.
Yeah.
You need a big program, and it has to be centrally, nationally organized, because it's not any particular advancement that we're promoting. It's not a particular success, not a technology, but it's a broader universal conception which is going to have reflections in so we have to have society that's nationally, like, we have to be able to recognize that people are contributing collaboratively to an effort that, you know, everyone benefits from.
Right.
And appreciates their participation in.
Well, that's why you need leadership, right? And the question is, you know, we have to supply that leadership. We have to supply that intellectual leadership and inspire people. And that can be done. That can be done, but we have to do it. So, I mean, I guess the thing is, you know, you have the material, you have these ideas, now go out and spread them. And bring more people in and get more people involved and tell people what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Get them happy to participate in it, get them passionate to fight for it. That's really the issue. I mean, to be really passionate to fight to bring this into existence.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you have a question?
I have a weird question.
Go ahead, but just speak louder, because I don't mind if it's weird. But if I can't hear it, I don't.
What's happening in Mexico? Like, they're not okay, right? Because, like, what you see on the news is really scary. Like, the riots up here, and like.
Well, Mexico, no, it's not okay, because it's been under attack now for more than 30 years. In 81, LaRouche was in Mexico, and he met with the president of Mexico at the time, Jose Lopez Portillo, and they came to an agreement about, well, Lopez Portillo was already committed in this direction for Mexico, because that was right around the time that the big oil fields were discovered. And he was committed to resisting the efforts of Kissinger and the British to seize the oil. And he said, I'm going to use this to improve the national economy. And he was under attack. The Mexican economy was under attack by the Wall Street bankers at the time. And so he, after meeting with LaRouche, took some important initiatives like nationalizing the banks and doing some things to defend the country. He had hoped at the time to get support from Brazil and Argentina and the other countries. He didn't get it. And he left office, and ever since then, the Mexican government has become increasingly corrupted by leaders who were loyal to Wall Street, and then assaulted from the other side by the drug cartels. And so that's been a deliberate policy to destroy Mexico. There's some new potential developments too that are happening there, especially out of the BRICS nations. But Mexico is, you know, another example, because that is a really powerful country and a really beautiful country. I went to Mexico. It was the first place I went to when I was outside the United States when I was 15 years old. I've never forgotten it. And I think that, you know, we have to, that's a country we really need to be working with. And it has tremendous potential. I've been to Mexico many times. I mean, the young people there, you know, there's a tremendous number of intellectuals and scientists, and artists, and so forth. So it's really the crime is being committed by the United States and the Wall Street banks and so forth. They foster this drug cartel up in Mexico, and it's been a major focus of LaRouche's work all the 40 years I've been involved in this. You know, to defend and save Mexico. We have an organization in Mexico, but it's very difficult for them to have much of an effect because people are terrified. Because, I mean, they do things that are important. They have conferences in the Chamber of Deputies, and they have, you know, we do things in Mexico. But it's hard for Mexico to assert itself because of these attacks. And that's one of the things that we really need to change. And then Mexico can be unleashed, and it's a real powerhouse. It's an important place. But it's under attack more than almost any other country in the Americas. And precisely because it's a powerhouse. Precisely because of what it could be. That's why there was Kissinger's slogan in the late 1970s was, "We don't want a new Japan south of our border." We're never going to let Mexico industrialize, and so they made sure that López Portillo didn't get his efforts were undermined, and they basically destroyed it. I mean, it's an extremely patriotic country too, which is a good strength of it. That could be revived if it got support from the United States. Mexico could really get revived very quickly. It's a very young country. It's just under attack, an unjust attack. And Obama's not helping. Bush was bad, and Obama's just as bad or worse in Mexico. And they promoted the drug cartels, right? And that terrifies. You can't have a country that doesn't have national sovereignty. And now they're trying to keep the government from cracking down on the drug cartels.
And we even supplied the drug cartels with weapons.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Obama.
Are they retaliating in one way? Is that why they're keeping Sergeant Tamarisi?
Who?
Sergeant Tamarisi, the Marine that's been there for 6 months.
I don't know if that's specific.
That's a discretion.
Yeah.
I don't understand why LaRouche would line himself up with Bill Clinton, whereas Clinton.
Go back to that. It goes back even before that thing that's in that timeline. But you know, LaRouche in the late 1950s, early 1960s was saying that the direction that was going with the Wall Street. He did an original study back in the 50s about the shift to the consumer-based economy, organized around the auto industry. So they started car loans to get people to buy a new car every 2 years, which is basically a way to get the finance industry into. You used to buy a car, it would last you, 5-10 years, right? Then you buy a new one. So, but they wanted to run the economy through a consumer-based economy. So they introduced these car loans, 2-year car loans, which was a big deal at the time. Now they're running 7-year car loans. and it was to create a finance-based economy instead of a physical economy, right? And if you look at what's happened in the entire post-war period, it's been financed by increasing amounts of debt. In the 1950s, one wage earner could support a family of 4, 5, or 6 with very little debt other than a mortgage, right? Today it takes 2, 3 wages to support a family with huge amounts of debt. Not just a mortgage, but a car loan, appliance, student loans, credit card debt, medical debt, insurance debt, all these debts. So it's just all been a finance-based economy. And in the 1950s, LaRouche was already fighting against that. So he didn't get much attention back during that period, but he got a huge amount of attention in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when he started to build a political movement among students at that time. And then in 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard, broke the Bretton Woods system, then he got a huge amount of attention because he had been the only economist who had not only forecast that, but warned that this was the beginning phase of putting the United States under a dictatorship run out of London and Wall Street. And that's what's happened for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
Right? We've been in one economic collapse after another, and an increasing form of dictatorship, which really escalated after 9/11, but was already coming into place before that.
Have you heard anything about if we end up with a complete world war going on in 2016, that there will be no election and he will just continue?
Well, that could happen before 2016, but the point is, if the war escalates that much, it's likely to escalate quickly into nuclear conflict, because they're taking on Russia and China.
Yeah.
And that's the danger.
Yeah.
I mean, the British monarchy wants a thermonuclear war between the United States, Russia, and China. They would like Russia and China to give up before the war starts, but that's not going to happen. So, you know, in nuclear war, you either surrender or the war happens. And if the war happens, it's an hour-and-a-half war and everybody's dead. It's not World War I.
No news allowed.
Okay, I think that's a good place to stop. Yeah. Thanks, Bruce.